I'm very excited to welcome Aryeh Green today, who's a wonderful author and also has a really fascinating job that I want to talk to everybody about. So Aryeh is the Chief Strategy Officer of Gigawatt Global, which is an organisation that provides renewable energy to Africa. And as everybody knows who follows me, I'm certainly a big one for promoting thoughts about the environment and managing climate change as the major thing that is part of our surroundings, which is one of my aspects of even star 5-star wellbeing surroundings. But Aryeh's book is what really attracted me to having him on the podcast, because I thought it just sounded like a fascinating journey, and doing a really long trek is something I'd love to do myself at some point. But his book is called My Israel Trail: Finding Peace in the Promised Land. And the trek he took was actually 800 miles, which is about 1,300 kilometres. It's what I calculated. I hope that's right. And that trek goes along the Israel National Trail, which goes from Israel's border with Lebanon in the north of the country to the border with Egypt in the south. So looks amazing from the photos I've seen and from what I have read about it. So really interested to hear more about that. And really the thing that appealed to me was the fact that Aryeh found this journey so healing for his spirit and for getting in touch with himself, which is something that, you know, I believe we're all here on this planet to do in this lifetime. So I was really keen to have him along to talk to us. And again, this is another one of my aspects of 5-star wellbeing, which I actually call just being, or it's part of that aspect of being is, you know, understanding and connecting with our spiritual selves, which, you know, is really who we are when we come down to it. So I'm really excited to have that chat with you. But before we get into the journey, as I mentioned before we hit record, Aryeh, I'd really love it if you could just give us a bit of a snapshot about Gigawatt Global and you know what the organisation does, what it's aiming to do, and yeah, anything else you'd like to tell us about it would be great.
Just wanted to say thank you for having me on the program, and obviously very nice to both meet you. And the conversation we just had was not just enjoyable, but there's just something uplifting about having the kind of connection in today that we can have on Zoom, literally halfway across the world. Gigawatt Global is a platform, a leading platform for renewable energy in emerging markets, and particularly in Africa. And so I appreciate your asking me, because our focus, obviously, of our conversation is going to be on the lessons learned for meeting personal challenges that I was privileged to learn while hiking the Israel Trail. But one of the, just jumping to kind of, it's a spoiler alert, one of the lessons that I learned, which usually we talk about at the end of this kind of a conversation, has to do with setting goals for ourselves and having a purpose in life. And there's no question that towards the end of my trek, I talk about this in my book, I made a decision that I would leave the job that I currently, or that at that time had, and that I would join my friend Yosef Abramowitz, who had set up this company to bring renewable energy to some of the most needy people on the planet in Africa, to help with their economic development and to provide humanitarian and other services. Obviously also to make a decent return for our investors, but to reach a number of different strategic and humanitarian economic goals, as well as the whole issue of bringing renewable energy as an answer to the challenge of the climate crisis that the planet faces. But it was, funny enough, or not funny enough, not coincidental, directly related to the results and lessons that I learned on the trail, which pointed me in the direction of trying to bring more meaning, more purpose to my life. And I've been really privileged in the last 5, 7, 8 years to help Yosef and the other team at Gigawatt Global to really be well on our way to achieve that goal of being a leading pioneering frontier renewable energy platform. We built the first utility scale solar field in sub-Saharan Africa, in Rwanda, in 2014.
Wow.
We just completed building the first major infrastructure project in 30 years in Burundi, which is one of the poorest nations on the planet. And that field has already started to provide electricity into the Burundi national grid. We're providing 15% of the country's electrical capacity as of just a few months ago. So very, very exciting. And we have projects that are underway and under development in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, Zambia, Nigeria, Kenya, Mozambique, Guinea, and other countries around sub-Saharan Africa, where we literally are changing people's lives by providing the clean and inexpensive energy that the solar or wind fields that we build can provide for these economically distressed nations and populations, who then can use this energy to secure all of the benefits that energy provide to a growing economy, whether it's dealing with food poverty issues, health issues, education, clean water, sanitation. All these things need energy. And so it's a very uplifting and exciting company to be involved with, because literally we I think demonstrate the incredible potential of this kind of pithy phrase, doing well by doing good. That you can make money as a business, as a company, as a for-profit enterprise, by being focused on a values-driven mission, and not only on the profit line. And when we talk about our 4 bottom lines, and our bottom line is financial, yes, we want to provide a decent return on to our investors, but we have 3 other bottom lines as well: humanitarian, and economic development, and then the climate issues related to the environment. And it's a very exciting time and an exciting company to be involved with. So thank you for asking.
That's really good. So is it a publicly listed company? So if people wanted to invest or support the organization in any other way, what can they do?
Thank you for asking that. No, we're not publicly traded. We are raising our last friends and family round of investment literally this month as we speak.
Okay.
Anybody who might be interested is welcome to reach out to me by email at aryeh@gigawattglobal.com. ARYEH@gigawattglobal.com, and we can put that up, I suppose.
I'll put it in the notes. Yeah.
As opposed to my personal email, aryeh.green@gmail.com, which also people can use for that or for other purposes if they're interested in the book or other information.
Okay.
But we're definitely raising our last friends and family round now before we move to our first institutional round, our Series A institutional funding round, which will come in a few months.
Okay. Oh, exciting. Oh, good on you for doing that. And thank you for telling us about it.
Not at all. Thank you, Aaron.
All right. So then let's get on to the main purpose for our talk, the trail. And I guess without necessarily sharing anything you don't want to share, but I'm of course curious to know why you felt like doing this kind of trek was what you needed to do at the time. And, especially why you thought doing that kind of exercise for yourself was what, was required for healing is what I'm really curious about.
Well, you can imagine within the context of the aspects of my story you're already familiar with, that I was divorced, and it was a divorce that I had not looked for. It was not my choice. So it really was devastating. It really turned my world upside down. And I basically set out to hike the trail only just a few weeks after finalizing the divorce, because I was just looking to escape. Let's be honest. I can't say that I had a specific goal in mind. Oh, I need to heal from the pain and suffering and anguish, of this divorce. I think I'll take a hike and challenge myself. 50 pounds, 25 kilos on my back, and hike 1,000 kilometers, starting out in the desert heat of Israel. That was not really, it was, I wouldn't say an act of desperation, but it was definitely an act of escape. I had hiked just a few months previously, my daughter finished her service in the Israel Defense Forces, and we took a little trip to Barcelona and then out to California, where I grew up. We went to Yosemite, which some of your listeners may be familiar with.
Yeah.
And we hiked up the face of a granite rock mountain called Half Dome, which soars over Yosemite Valley, a few thousand feet, literally of sheer face of granite. And it was exhilarating. It was the most emotionally and physically and psychologically challenging thing that I'd ever done. And we hiked it up together, myself and my 21-year-old daughter. And I mean, we almost didn't make it up halfway through. We sat there and cried and held each other and tried not to fall off the side of the cliff. And I said to her, we don't have to do this. We don't have to go any further. This is, terrific what we've achieved already. But we made it to the top. And I said to her, holding her at the top, you know what? This has given me the impetus, as it were. I'm going to hike the Israel Trail. We knew that the divorce was imminent at that point. This was perhaps August, September, and we knew that the divorce was going to go through. But I looked at her and I said, I'm going to hike the Israel Trail. It was that kind of a feeling of looking for some sort of release to a certain extent. So when the divorce came through, I was already kind of well ahead with my planning. You have to plan pretty well to hike the Israel Trail, because the first few weeks in the desert, you have to plan food drops and water drops or deliveries or plants or what have you, in order to make sure. There are a number of different segments in the desert where you can go for a day or 2 days without any contact with civilization and without any prospect of resupply, and especially for the desert. So water is crucial. So I was pretty well advanced with the planning by the time it was clear that the divorce was coming through, and I just set out with the intention to hike as much as I could without really understanding what I was getting into. I mean, that's the funny part of maybe the first day or the first couple of days of the trip. What have I gotten myself into? Whose idea was this? I didn't sign up for a challenge trek, trying to hike 12 to 15 miles a day with a 50-pound, 25-kilo pack on my back. I mean, this was crazy. But funny enough, you used the word healing. There's no question that in the kind of after the fact, looking back on the experience, that is really what I achieved. It was an incredibly healing and uplifting experience that helped me to move on with my life, to move ahead with my life after the divorce.
Wonderful. And probably the majority of my listeners won't know anything about the trail itself. So I'd love you to tell us a bit about that and, what its significance is, both nationally within Israel, historically, and also was there any significance for you personally in deciding to hike that particular trail?
Well, it's a multi-tiered question, and so I kind of have to divide the latter question of its significance to me is almost a whole discussion in and of itself. The first question, it is a good idea to share just a few basic preliminary facts about the trail. So it's really culture from the beginning time, even before the founding of the country, is tied up with walking the land. There's a phrase in the Hebrew Bible, "Kum v'hita lech ba'aretz," get up and walk through the land, which is almost, yes, a religious imperative, but the Bible as history, the Bible as family journal, is the way that the Jewish people, the people of Israel, view the book itself and the content of it. So that kind of a phrase, get up and walk throughout the land, ends up being a cultural and social and communal imperative, even beyond the idea of a religious commandment or a connection to any religiosity or spiritual element of it. But it's very strongly spiritual, even for those people who don't consider themselves religiously observant. And that's true for Jews, Christians, Muslims, or others. The connection to the land and walking in literally the footsteps of our ancestors is a very significant part of the experience. But I was saying, just by way of introduction, that as a cultural element of Israeli society, our kids in school from an early age, from age 5, go on annual trips, walking tours, hikes. And every year, every class has at least a 1 day. And from the age of about 10, they go on 2 days. In the age high school, they go on 3-day hikes, overnight backpacks, what have you. And often, just from my personal perspective, a parent or two will accompany the class trips. I happen to have the privilege of being both a trained medic in the IDF, and I play the guitar and sing songs around a campfire. And I also happen to have a license to carry a gun. And so schools were always enthusiastic for
you volunteered.
Yeah, that's right. That I volunteered to join my 3 children in all of their school outings, because I basically could kill literally 3 birds with 1 stone, because every trip needs a medic to accompany them. They need a guard to accompany them because of our security situation, and they're very happy to have somebody to play the guitar around the campfire at night. So from a cultural perspective, the Israel Trail was established as kind of an extension of that social shared value and practice of walking, hiking, day trips and outings in the land. And in 1995, it was established by the Society for Protection of Nature in Israel and the Israel Nature Authority and the Parks and Recreation, the National Park Authority, as a basically 1,000-kilometer trail, as you already mentioned, from the south to the north, going through the desert in the Negev, going up the Jerusalem hills to Jerusalem, and then down to the coast along the Mediterranean coast, and up to the Galilee, and the forests of the Galilee up to the Lebanese border. And where there weren't trails that could be connected, already existing hiking trails, there were a number of segments that were added in order to connect them. From a social standpoint, it's for many years, Israeli 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds finishing their national service in the IDF or in a hospital or what have you, would go on a trek in South America to Machu Picchu, or out to Nepal, or go to India to kind of chill out and maybe get a new kind of lease on life and a different perspective after their 2 or 3 years of national service. More and more, starting in the late 90s, those 21-year-olds would hike the Israel Trail instead, or in addition.
So when was the trail actually completed?
1995, it was established.
Okay.
And as I said, it was a connection, a kind of a compilation of the already existing trails and the addition of some new ones. So the usual cohort hiking the Israel Trail, certainly as through hikers doing the whole trail at once, are the 21-year-old crowd that are finished with their national service. So at 51, I was kind of a bit unusual. At my age, there are many informal groups and even a few formal groups that will do a day's hike every month to try to complete the trail in a few years, or a week every summer to complete the trail in a few years, or what have you. That's not unusual. I have friends who've done that, and I joined some of them. But the idea of doing it as in one shot is really for the younger generation. So I was a bit unusual at 51 to set out to do that. But it is something which also is very much part of the Israeli kind of familial milieu of the culture of Israel. And here I mean both Jews and Arabs, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, who open their homes to hikers on the Israel Trail. This is a phenomenon that doesn't exist in any other trail. Not in the Spanish and Portuguese Pilgrim's Trail, not at Machu Picchu, not in Nepal. Obviously, you can pay to stay in somebody's home at an Airbnb type of setup. But in Israel, through hikers on the trail, called shvilistim in Hebrew, those who hike the trail, are welcome. There's a list of what are called trail angels. And these are individuals or families or students in apartments, or sometimes a kibbutz or a moshav, one of the communal settlements of Jewish farming communities, kind of on a more socialist basis of shared property, what have you, who will have special rooms set aside, pre-military academies and yeshiva and high schools and colleges, which will have a room set aside. Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem has a room set aside that's maintained by its nursing staff So it's a really very interesting and certainly unique aspect of the Israel Trail experience. You have these trail angels where you can sleep overnight. They'll make you food. They'll let you shower and give you a bed and maybe do your laundry and give you a ride back to the trailhead the next morning. Really, just a lovely and very unusual element that reflects I said, familial nature of Israeli society as kind of one big family, not just a national identity. So that gives you a little bit of background about the Israel Trail itself, as you asked. Then you asked about the personal connection. And there's no question that, I mean, as I said, I hiked up in Yosemite. I spent summers growing up in California, hiking in the Pacific Coast Range in the high Sierras. I love hiking, and hiking for its natural beauty or for the challenge, the physical challenge, is obviously speaks, to many people and it has its own value. But there is nothing, absolutely nothing that can compare to hiking and walking in the footsteps of your ancestors.
Yeah.
That could be true for anybody who's Aboriginal or a native of a particular area. Certainly for me as a Jew, walking in the land where our prophets walked, where King David, I remember walking through the Judean desert nature reserve, where I was acutely aware that this is the actual physical area where King David fled from King Saul, as described in the Hebrew Bible. And all of a sudden you're aware, well, wait a minute, the prophets of Israel, Nathan, others, they came to the desert to find their spiritual awakening, find their connections with the Almighty, to connect with the universe. It's true for Jesus. It's true for many, I think, religious traditions and spiritual traditions, where the desert, for instance, as a silent place of meditation, provided an environment for reflection. And the combination of that reality and this understanding that, if not literally walking in the footsteps of my ancestors, which was much of the time actually factual, certainly the feeling of wandering the desert like the children of Israel, or wandering the Galilee forests like the tribes of Israel did 2,000 years ago, was a very powerful element of the hike on the Israel Trail.
Yeah, that gives me goosebumps. It's so true. And I can really relate to that. And I was going to say, it's that whole thing of walking the land is, such an indigenous concept. And I don't mean that for any particular culture, but for all cultures. It's, we should be in touch and connected with the land that is indigenous to us. And for me, I always have felt really strongly about the hikes that I did in the UK, which is obviously where my ancestry is from. And, I just felt so amazing doing those more than any other hike. And, I'm the same as you. I love hiking, but there's something about being on the land of your ancestors. That's really so beautiful to hear you say that. And interesting, you just mentioned about the silence of the desert, because that was going to be my next question, was how important do you feel it was in terms of it, the healing or, the transition that you made through the journey, that you had so many big chunks of time where you were alone, and what that meant?
Well, there's no question that I had a number of different peak experiences, I would call them, formative, transformative experiences while doing the hike. And I started to mention the Judean desert and being aware that was where King David went. There was another one up in the Galilee in the forest, where I stumbled across a tombstone, or not a tombstone, a grave site. And it said on it, Eliyahu ben Amotz, Eliyahu the son of Amotz. And that was a curiosity. I decided it was a good place in the shade of a tree to take a break, took out my water. And because I had cellular reception, which I didn't always have, and I usually didn't have in the course of the hike, I decided to turn on my phone and take a look at Google to see where I was. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, this was the traditionally understood to be the gravesite of Elijah the prophet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the swords and plowshares. Sorry, I don't mean Elijah. My apologies. Isaiah the prophet.
Uh-huh.
Isaiah, the one of the swords and plowshares, on the lintel of the United Nations building. Obviously the phraseology that almost any school child from a Christian or Jewish or Muslim tradition recognizes, the lamb laying down with the lion and beating swords to plowshares. And this is the tomb of Isaiah the prophet, literally or virtually unmarked in the midst of a forest. There's not even a paved road to get to it as a site of pilgrimage. Now, I found out later, I mentioned this in the book, I found out later as I did some research, in the book, there's some disagreement among historians, archaeologists, and scholars. Is Isaiah buried there, or is Isaiah buried in another tomb in the area of Jerusalem? But that historicity was not important to me at the time. And the important of the example is walking in the land of our forefathers, where you're stumbling across, and this happened multiple times, evidence of the connection that we have to that land. That's where you're quite right. Call it Aboriginal, call it our ancestral homeland, call it the native people of the region. The idea that 3,500, 3,000, 2,500, 2,000 years ago, my ancestors, the forefathers of the Jewish people, whether it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, let alone more recently, we're literally, I keep using the word literally, I shouldn't. We're walking the same paths. It was something that was I would say, a very, very big part of that healing of mine, because it gave me a perspective of sorts on my people, on my place in the wider swath of history. It enabled me to connect to this family, tribal, clan, national connection that I had and and the gratitude that wells up inside me for the privilege of being part of this generation, that after 2,000 years of dispersal, the people of Israel have returned to the land of Israel. And we have this experience in renewed sovereignty in our homeland. The understanding that I'm just part of a greater swath of history was instrumental in my ability to take in stride, which is a great turn of phrase I haven't used before. Striding along, hiking the land of Israel. So taking in stride the pain and the suffering and the anguish that I was feeling as a result of the divorce, and putting it into some greater historical context. And that's why the first lessons that I learned in walking the trail were the lessons of humility and acceptance and gratitude that were part and parcel of not just the desert experience, but this understanding of being kind of a part of a longer story and a wider picture than just my own experience and my own sadness.
But how do you think the fact that you were alone, what significance do you think that had? Like, if you could imagine you were actually instead doing it with a friend or a member of your family or whatever, what difference do you think it would make?
That's a great question, and the difference is phenomenal. And I think the second chapter of my book focuses on the humility that was engendered by walking, day after day, hour after hour, minute after minute through the silence of the desert. We're recording a podcast where silence is kind of anathema. I don't think that you would welcome, a moment of silence and reflection for us to just sit here and not speak, because people listen to podcasts to hear us talk, not to enjoy a moment of silence. But I would say to our listeners, that the idea of pressing pause on a podcast like this and just listening to the silence for 30 seconds, if you do that, in fact, I will say to anybody listening to this podcast now, I would invite you to press pause now. And if you've done that, if you pressed pause, I hope you waited for 15 or 20 seconds. Do that now. And it's phenomenal to recognize it's really hard to sit in silence for 15 or 30 seconds. We don't recognize, how long it feels. It feels like an eternity just 15 or 20 seconds. And then think of how it would feel walking minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day in the silence of the desert, where you're enveloped in this sound of silence, if you want to quote Simon and Garfunkel. I mean, the aloneness that I felt that I talk about in the book, I played with the word and came up with the real reflection of being part of something bigger than myself and connecting to the wider universe by the experience of the silence in the desert, created for me a transition from the concept of aloneness, which implies loneliness, which is a negative emotion, to all oneness, taking the same word and understanding that, in fact, if you're alone in the desert and connected to the rest of the universe, so you're not alone. You're at one with the universe. And so, I mean, I meditated on mountaintops, and I cried in dry creek beds, and I wrote anguished journal entries and lifted songs, composed songs to lift my spirits. And I looked back and inward and up to the night sky and over the valley to the next mountain range, down to the ants in the dirt, back along the trail to see how far I'd come. And basically, through that aloneness, through that being alone in the silence of the desert, I really discovered on the trail a sense of self, a sense of personal and even national history and a perspective of sorts on the human condition. So there's no question. Your query is right on target. There's no way I would have experienced that. There's no way I would have reached the depths of an understanding of this kind of humility and modesty in my place in the universe, or this acceptance that this is my lot, this is what I have to deal with, this is my challenge, and not to feel it as something overwhelming or unfair or that the universe was conspiring against me. And the sense of gratitude and appreciation for the blessings I do have in my life, none of that would have occurred had I been walking along and just chatting away with somebody else, in this sort of hike.
Yeah, that's what I would have suspected. And just a couple of practical things. So first of all, is it actually silent in the desert? Do you hear birds or anything?
Well, there were, I can answer in general, but of course, every day, every hour was different. There were, it's true that in much of the desert, there are some sounds, birds, as you said, but there were definitely a number of days, and certainly more than just a few moments or hours, where the silence was, if not overwhelming, certainly absolute. There were some times in particular parts of the desert in the Negev, in those first 3 weeks, where there were no birds, where there were no beetles on the ground. There was no, and there might have been the wind, rattling in my ears, but it reminded me of there is a description which is not Isaiah but Elijah, and that's why I was mistaken earlier, confusing the two. Elijah went up on the mountain in the Carmel mountain range, and I'm sure you or our listeners may be familiar with the description of being on the quiet and the wind of a mountaintop, where Elijah did not hear or see or experience God in the lightning or the thunder or the rain or the noise, but only eventually in the still small voice of the silence of the mountaintop. I don't think it's a coincidence. We were mentioning this kind of obliquely earlier. I don't think it's a coincidence that so many of our spiritual traditions, whether it's Buddha and a meditative Zen sitting type of environment, or whether it's Moses on Mount Sinai, or whether it's Jesus in the desert, that so many of our religious traditions relate to the kind of revelation or inspiration that occurs within the context of the silence of the desert. And so I can say that even when that silence was interrupted by a bird call or some rustling movement or what have you, it was still powerful. But there were definitely a number of times, as I said, in instances where the silence was really absolute, and those were some of the most inspiring moments of my trek, without question.
Yeah. Well, that concept would just be so strange to anyone who lives in our modern world. We never have silence, do we? So, yeah. And I just also wanted to check about you mentioned having to do food or water drops along the way. So can you just tell us about the practicalities of that? So did that mean you had to drive out before you actually set out walking? Is that how
Yeah, so I drove down from my home near Jerusalem, in the foothills of Jerusalem, down to a lot on the border with Egypt and on the shores of the Red Sea. And on the way down, I buried in 3 different spots some supplies, water and canned goods, treats, chips in closed bags and the like, in places that were accessible, that I knew were on the trail itself. And in addition to that, there were 4 different instances where I paid a desert tour company to ensure that there was water waiting for me at a particular spot that they described, in areas that weren't accessible to me in a normal car, but only to a Jeep or to.
Yeah.
Some of the anecdotes that I describe in the book include one where I got to the water drop and there wasn't any water there. And that was frightening, because I was in the midst of a 3-day part of the trek where there were no other opportunities to resupply. It's literally a matter of life and death, because you're in the desert. If you don't have your 5 liters of water, you're going to be in serious trouble. So I ended up having to climb up a top of a hill for 45 minutes to get cell phone reception, to call the desert tour company that had promised there'd be water where they promised. And true to their commitment, they came out at 2 a.m. While I was asleep. I was woken because I heard them, but I tried to continue to sleep in my tent, and dropped off 6 liters of water as promised, which explains why instead of paying, let's say, just for lack of a better reference point, $1 Australian per liter of water, you buy a 6-pack of water, you're going to spend $6. Terrific, that's wonderful, at a supermarket. And here I literally spent 15 Australian dollars per liter of water.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason that you spend that, because you resent it when you spend it, you're paying some company this much money for a bit of water. No, but the guarantee is it will be there.
Yeah.
If it's not there, they will make sure. So I say it's a funny anecdote. It wasn't funny at the time.
No.
But and this desert company, I mean, it's a fellow who lives in the desert, and this is what he does for a living. Left me some chocolate bars.
Right, to sweeten the deal.
As a treat, right?
Yeah. And so, but when nice. With the ones where you buried stuff, how did you remember where they were?
James Bond type of notes to myself in my journal or in my maps, to remind myself where they were. Take 10 steps from the tree that's on the southern part of the trail, and then turn 90 degrees and take 5 steps down the ravine, and next to the large boulder with a bit of moss on it. Yeah, that's where you're going to find it's kind of funny.
Wow. Okay. Okay, so I guess I know we're coming up to our time, but I wanted to finish off just by asking you, for people who, for whatever reason, can't, do this kind of journey of self-discovery that you did, what would your advice be, for things that they could maybe do in a more ordinary day-to-day way, or, a smaller way than what you did? Do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, since kind of one of our focuses jointly, yours and mine, is kind of spirituality, it's not so much the hiking side of things. I will say, and I mentioned in the book a particular meditative practice that I had discovered previous to the trek, but that I incorporated into the trek and then expanded on, which I will say, I think anybody with the minimum of quiet space to focus in. And that could be in your living room or kitchen or balcony or garden, or if you're lucky enough to have within 5 or 10 minutes drive or walk, from your home, a forest area or a hilltop or a grassy meadow or what have you. I found a particular meditative practice of slow meditative walking to be eminently replicable in almost any circumstance. And I can say, honestly, I have used this meditative practice almost everywhere I've ever been, including in hotel rooms while on business trips. So although it came out of in fact, a silent meditation retreat that I had gone to in the midst of the divorce, and happened to be in the hills south of Jerusalem, in a very beautiful and peaceful mountain setting, on the edge of the desert, for the record. It can be replicated, as I say, almost anywhere, even not in a setting of natural beauty or desert. And it involves slowly walking with a certain meditative practice. In my case, it was choosing a particular phrase from the Bible that combines some of these issues of humility and appreciation and acceptance into a very pithy phrase that you can use while stepping very slowly, balancing your weight from the back front to the front foot, in a very slow meditative walking experience. But obviously each individual could find their own phrases. I'll share with you, just because perhaps you or our listeners might be interested, the phrase that I was focused on at the time, which I return to frequently, is what the first time the name of God is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, where Moses, at the burning bush, basically says, "What the heck is going on here?" This bush is burning and not being consumed. And God comes and says, "This is a holy place. Remove your shoes as a sign of respect." And a conversation ensues, towards the end of which Moses says, "Who are you?" And God's answer is, "I am who I am." In Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which I won't go into the details now. I do a bit in my book, in a footnote. It's almost impossible to translate. I am what I am. I will be what I will be. The past, the present, the future tense is all confused and combined in the Hebrew. The conjunction that connects the two is full of meaning. I am where I'll be. I am what I'll be. I am who I am. I am as I am. The world is what it is. And in fact, it goes to one of my teenage friends used to use that phrase, which obviously was not unique to him, where he would say, "It is what it is."
Yeah.
And that's another way of translating this particular name of God. And I would take very slow walking steps, each one balancing from the front to the back foot with this phrase, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. What will be, will be. Sarah, Sarah. What is, is. And there are other phrases that obviously you and others can choose for themselves that have meaning. For me, that was something that was profoundly meaningful and spiritually uplifting, transformative, and is something that you don't have to hike 1,000 kilometers with a 50-pound, 25-kilo pack on your back. You don't have to find yourself in the midst of a silent desert in order to take 10 or 20 minutes out of your day to focus and to breathe deeply and to allow yourself to have that meditative, contemplative time to center our being and to connect with the rest of the universe and accept that the world is unfolding exactly as it's meant to, even if sometimes it doesn't seem to be, or it doesn't seem to be going in the direction we want it to.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. That's exactly, exactly the kind of thing that I think anybody can find useful anywhere. And I do love that phrase of "I am who I am" as well. And we're so distracted in our modern lives that it's just so powerful to bring ourselves back to a phrase like that, similar to that, or whatever else is meaningful to someone, to really bring them into themselves again. So
very, very much so. I would only add one other thing, just to come a little bit less on the spiritual side, more on the practical side. I don't know. You're all the way over there in Australia. How many people can see within the context of the coronavirus pandemic and everything else going on in the modern world? But I often encourage people who are visiting Israel. Obviously, if people are thinking of Israel, I encourage people to come visit. It's obviously a wonderful thing to do. And people who visit Israel, I encourage to get off the beaten track.
Yeah.
Obviously, you'll go to the tourist places and the places of historical meaning and religious meaning, and it's all important and very good. But the Israel Trail can beckon even a casual hiker for a day or a half a day or just an hour or two, right outside of Tel Aviv, right outside of Jerusalem, very near some of the major tourist attractions, are also just wonderful kind of corners of incredible beauty and meaning on the Israel Trail, which people can experience. And I encourage people to experience without, as I said, hiking 1,000 kilometers with a 25-kilo pack on your back. You can experience for a few hours or a half a day some of the joys of hiking the Israel Trail without doing the whole thing necessarily.
Yeah. And that's true anywhere. Once we can one day get to travel again, you know, for anyone to wherever you're going, get off the beaten track and really connect with the spirit of the place that you are visiting. Yeah, thank you for saying that. So I guess we need to, you mentioned before your email for work purposes for Gigawatt Global, but what's the best way for people to get in touch with you or to buy your book is probably the main thing that people might be interested in.
Thank you for asking, Arwen. So the book, by the way, website is myisraeltrail.com, www.myisraeltrail.com. My contact information is there as well. People who want to email me directly can do so at aryeh.green@gmail.com, ARYEH.green, like the color, at gmail.com. And I'm always happy to hear from people who are interested in the trail or in the healing from the meeting of personal challenges that we all face, and the 5 elements and the lessons that I learned on the trail. But yeah, there's more information at the website also, myisraeltrail.com.
Yeah, great. And you do have your first chapter available for free on the website, which I did read myself. So that's a great one to pique everybody's interest in.
Thank you for saying so.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. All right. Well, I really appreciate your time. I'm so glad we worked out a time when we could both get to bed.
That was a bit of a challenge.
It is a bit of a challenge.
Thank you to Podmatch for connecting us.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Shout out.
Yeah. It's really, really great idea. So yes, thank you. And I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure everybody will find it uplifting and inspiring, especially in these times when we can only journey in our minds, where we are at the moment anyway. So thank you once again.
Well, not at all. And Arwen, thank you. Thank you for your interest and for your time. And I feel particularly blessed and privileged, without waxing too poetic, because there are very few upsides to this pandemic. But one of them I feel is this ability that we have through the technology of Zoom and other online platforms. I feel that, I'm privileged to have met you and to have been able to speak with you. And, I don't think that we probably would have met, at least, you never know how God works in amazing and miraculous ways. But I don't see myself getting over to Australia anytime necessarily in the near future, pandemic or not. And so I really appreciate your invitation. It was nice to meet you.
Yes, you too. Thank you so much.
Made a connection.
Take care.
It's a pleasure. You too, Arwen. Thank you again.